Good afternoon from London, everyone, and welcome to the launch of the OMFIF and Luxembourg for Finance report, examining forging a path to international standards in sustainable finance. The report considers what is required for the standardization of sustainable finance, taking insight from interviews of experts across the financial sector and the real economy. It explores the latest developments in taxonomy regulation and reporting frameworks, challenges around disclosure and data, the role of the real economy, as well as varying approaches to transitioning the financial sector and wider economy to net zero, and how we can drive more convergence to achieve this. So I'm Emma McGarvey, head of OMFIF Sustainable Policy Institute. We'll begin firstly with an opening keynote by Luxembourg for Finance's CEO, Nicolas Miquel, before providing an overview of the key report findings. We'll then go into a panel discussion with leading experts from the Financial Stability Board, the ECB, Japan's Financial Service Agency, and also BASF. So Nicolas, it's a pleasure to have you, and it's been a pleasure working on this report with you. Over to you.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Emma, for this introduction. As you said, I'm the CEO of Luxembourg for Finance and thus a proud partner of the report that was produced by OMFIF and the team around Emma and her colleagues. So thank you very much for that partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, also a warm welcome from my side to you for this discussion. Before I hand over to the experts to look at the real topic of forging the path to international standards in sustainable finance, please allow me a few minutes to just say more general words about where we are with sustainable finance, in particular, as you will certainly understand, in the context of the geopolitical situation that the world is facing. Obviously, our attention is very much focused on the war in Ukraine and the human tragedy that is happening there. But sustainable finance and in particular climate change is not going away. As the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has reminded us only a few days ago, the urgency is exactly now. Now is the time when we need to act. Now is the time when we can still change things. Last week only, temperatures at both the North and the South Pole were reported to have been breaking records. And if, according to the IPCC report, we do not, as of now and before 2025, really take action, there will be irreparable damage done. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, as I said initially, there is a more urgent crisis happening for the moment, and human nature unfortunately has it that it is difficult to manage more than one large crisis at a time. What is the impact of the Ukraine war on our discussion on the future of the fight against climate change, on our ambitions in sustainable finance? Well, immediately, I think that what you have seen is an energy crunch that leads to higher prices. Of course, if this continues, this will, in a very first step in the short term, push for more fossil energy to be used, which of course is contrary to what everything we are trying to do. But if there is to be any sort of silver lining, and it's very difficult in the current context to actually even be contemplating something like that, it is maybe that Mr. Putin will have managed to push us in the medium to long term to contemplate massive investments into renewable energy, because that is ultimately the only way, and I think there's a consensus on this by now, that we will wean ourselves off, whether it is his oil and gas or that of any other autocrats. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, even in the current context of geopolitical tensions, what is very important for the future of our fight against climate change is that our leaders and our nations maintain the capacity to even dialogue between different countries, between those economies that really are important in this discussion, so as to find path forward to tackle the climate crisis. Now, what I would also like to simply throw out into the discussion this afternoon, but of course don't expect an answer on it, is 3 or 4 questions that are very, very heavily weighing on me. The first one is relating to, all of them are relating to the current situation and the discussion around banning imports of Russian gas. Our discussion here is more about sustainable finance, but what I fail to understand in a certain way is how the fact that we continue to import Russian gas and how we pay for Russian gas with money that will ultimately be used to continue to wage this war and perpetrate these unspeakable acts of terror on civilians in Ukraine, how that can be compatible with the talk that we keep maintaining on sustainable finance. Of course, nations have interests, but also nations maybe should lead by example. And if nations are not capable of taking hard decisions for reasons related other than the economic pain, how will we in the future be able to tell companies that they will have to look carefully at their investments and at the impact that their investments have on, for instance, not only climate consequences, but social consequences, how their investments are squareable with human rights, with social rights, and so on. The real question is ultimately, will the way we go about now prolonging importing oil and gas from Russia not justify a certain exoneration for a certain level of economic pain that would introduce some sort of a threshold under which that could be justified? I hope not, and I doubt it, but I really think that that is something we need to look at very, very carefully. And governments, as I said before, should lead by example if they are to take sustainable finance seriously. Now, ladies and gentlemen, finance is, of course, as everybody has understood, also the tool that the Western nations have chosen to help force Russia to stop this war. It is actually a driving force in this war, as it is a driving force in our fight against climate change. Climate finance is and will be the instrument for us to stop the rising of temperatures through the massive investments that will be done and that have to be done. If we want to build a more sustainable tomorrow, investments will have to be able to flow across the globe. And this is where I come to the topic of the report that we have commissioned OMFIF to produce, namely about convergence and divergence of international standards, because that is exactly what investments will need. A little bit like with accounting standards, if you want these investments to be able to flow around the world, well, there needs to be a framework that makes things understandable, not only a common language, but also parameters that help investors understand how what they know from their domestic market translates into this market. And that is where I am very grateful for the OMFIF team to have produced such a comprehensive overview of the different regimes that currently exist, as well as compare it with other markets, as for instance the United States market, that doesn't have, for instance, a taxonomy and doesn't seem to be going down that route. But nevertheless, of course, these are important markets for investors. But I will hand over now to one of the authors of the report to give you the main findings of it. Thank you very much to you, and thank you very much to the OMFIF team for this excellent cooperation, and I look forward to listening to the discussion of the panel afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. And if I may keep you for a minute, we have had a question from the audience, and I wonder if you'd be opening to answering it just before we pass on to the presentation of findings. So we've had a question from John Adams from China Financial Services, who's saying China has agreed that US auditors can have access to accounts of US listed Chinese COSs. So will the standards of sustainable finance also be comparable over jurisdictions?
So I think that's first of all something laudable, the fact that there is an increased interoperability of accounting standards and access to the actual information. The same, of course, would be good if it could happen in the area of sustainable finance standards. As I said before, and as I think the thrust of the report that is about to be presented will show, it is in the interest of the investment world to have interoperability of standards. Now, if in the US, for instance, there is more of a market-based approach and not a top-down regulatory framework that defines what is green and what is not, as we have, for instance, in the European Union, but as China also has created, certainly in the bond market, as you detail in the report, I think we still want to see an increased convergence of these standards. And if there isn't a standard in one place, as with the accounting standards, I think what you will see is that one of the existing standards will probably end up becoming an informal standard for global operators. Because if you comply with that standard, well, from an efficiency point of view, you can then sell your products with the same sort of green label across the world, instead of having to comply to multiple diverging standards. I hope that answers the question.
And I think it does. And as you say, this is something that we explore in detail in the report. And I think this is a great opportunity to turn over to Taylor Pierce, who is co-author of the report, for a kind of more detailed insight into the report findings and what we examined in the report. So Taylor, over to you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today, and thank you, Emma. My name is Taylor Pierce, and I'm an economist here at OMFIF and co-author of this report. I'm delighted to share the key findings of our report with you today, which will no doubt be discussed more in depth in the following panel discussions. Great. So as Emma mentioned, the aim of this report was to highlight some of the key topics, opportunities, and challenges of embedding sustainable finance within the global financial system. To guide us in our research on these topics, we conducted 15 expert interviews with stakeholders from across the ESG space, primarily those working in the financial sector, but also public sector actors, as well as experts on ESG and sustainability in the real economy. Before I move to the key findings, I just wanted to thank all of our interviewees once again, a few of whom will be speaking shortly on our panel discussion. We're very appreciative of your insights on these themes. So thank you very much. Here's an overview of our key findings, which I will walk through now, finishing up with the practical implications for market actors and regulators operating in the sustainable finance space. So our first key finding relates to taxonomy frameworks. Many jurisdictions have now implemented or are in the process of developing their own taxonomies for sustainable projects and activities, while many others have not. The table here shows the G20 countries which have already developed or are in the process of developing a taxonomy for sustainable activities. Most notably, the European Union and China have both developed their own taxonomies. Some jurisdictions are waiting for international standards to become the norm before implementing a taxonomy framework, while others, namely the US, have taken a more market-led approach. And the US has not thus far given any indication that it will be developing or implementing any taxonomy framework. While it is laudable that so many countries and jurisdictions are now introducing sustainable taxonomies, this mushrooming of standards has led to significant challenges. In response to this fragmentation, there are growing calls from stakeholders in ESG finance for a common language and common criteria of sustainable activities, which could take the form of an international framework. At the very least, this baseline would need to facilitate international interoperability, especially in the standardization of ESG terminology and definitions. At the same time, a global framework must allow for local specification, accommodating some of the key differences faced by different jurisdictions and by institutions operating within those jurisdictions, in the drive toward a sustainable economy, such as political, cultural, ecological, and developmental variation. As countries move forward with their own frameworks, striking this balance at the international level is becoming increasingly difficult. The EU-China Common Ground Taxonomy could provide a foundation for building further interoperability across jurisdictions, but these efforts for a global baseline are complicated by the US opting for a market-led approach. Nevertheless, given that an increasing number of US funds are now turning to EU taxonomy regulation for guidance, this seems to indicate that a market-led approach alone is not sufficient, once again showing the importance of an international regulatory framework. So this brings me to my next slide. Our next key finding relates to mandatory disclosure and reporting frameworks. It's the second building block of any ESG regulatory framework, as it were. As more and more robust data increases transparency and risk understanding, a mandatory disclosure framework is vital in driving convergence and sustainable practice for the financial sector. Once again, we have seen a proliferation of different standards and frameworks across jurisdictions. The EU has so far led the way with the SFDR coming into force last year, although the TCFD looks on track to become the global baseline. Even the US, a laggard in ESG financial regulation, has made progress on disclosures. The recent SEC ruling has introduced mandatory disclosures broadly in line with the TCFD framework, particularly with governance, strategy, and metrics, although there is still some uncertainty as to which strategies companies will be required to disclose. Like with taxonomy frameworks, the multitude of reporting frameworks causes confusion for actors in the financial sector. In some cases, financial institutions are being asked to disclose the same or very similar metrics multiple times under multiple frameworks. This so-called double reporting leaves the financial market increasingly trying to adapt to new requirements, which can be very time-consuming and costly. The ISSB is a promising effort on behalf of the IPSF to enable convergence, of various reporting standards and regulatory frameworks globally, streamlining this process. While it's been received positively, it has only just come into force in last November, I think, so more time will be needed to assess its efficacy. This brings me to my next key finding, which is the role of the public sector in sustainable finance is increasing. Regulators set the language and tone for conduct and practice in sustainable finance and are responsible for developing both taxonomies and mandated disclosures, as previously discussed. At the same time, the public sector scope is also expanding beyond the introduction and enforcement of these guidelines, including taxonomies and disclosure and reporting frameworks. Central banks, for example, are becoming more involved by implementing and improving climate stress testing and risk analysis tools, as seen in this table. And this is a huge step for market-wide incorporation of climate risk into pricing. NGFS membership also has grown and now totals 108 central banks around the world. At the same time, public investors, including central banks, sovereign funds, and pension funds, are also increasing their holdings of green bonds, as seen in the other figure here. Nevertheless, this expansion is taking place in an asymmetric way across jurisdictions. And there's a general consensus among market actors that more international coordination in ESG regulation is needed. Otherwise, the result is a chaotic environment, which is confusing for the financial sector. Though the scope of the public sector's role in ESG finance varies by geography, once again, we see that US funds are increasingly turning to the EU for guidance on ESG regulation and standards. And this, again, emphasizes the need for regulatory structure, even within jurisdictions which are pursuing a market-led approach. Moving on, this is our fourth key finding. Though ESG standards and regulations are increasing in complexity and scope, some of the more practical and most rudimentary questions have yet to be addressed, which relates to our key finding of the real economy and the need to increase the connection between finance and the real economy in the ESG space. As the role of sustainable finance is ultimately driving the sustainable transition of real economic activity, our findings revealed that much work is still to be done to strengthen this connection. The financial sector is taking a more active role, having introduced new products and strategies, including screening, labeled bond issuance, active ownership, and potentially divestment of emissions-intensive industries. However, in terms of disclosure, reporting, and data gathering, there is a large disconnect between the requirements for the financial sector and for the real economy in both content and timing of ESG initiatives. In large part, this is due to the complexities of the real economy, such as supply chain interlinkages and sectoral connectivities, which pose significant challenges for the standardization of transition frameworks. For example, although the TCFD is becoming mandatory in a number of jurisdictions and the SFRD is already in force in the EU, non-financial corporate reporting is still significantly behind. Oftentimes in the current regulatory environment, the financial sector cannot meet mandated or soon-to-be mandated disclosure requirements because they lack the data from their investee companies. In order to mandate disclosure in the real economy, more guidance and capacity building are needed first for non-financial corporates, especially small and medium enterprises. In the meantime, though financial institutions' disclosures are often reliant on this data from their investee companies, and mandated non-financial corporate disclosures will significantly help in closing these data gaps, this should not stop financial institutions from disclosing themselves, gathering ESG information, and setting transition targets. Finally, beyond climate-related disclosures, we found that most progress has been made on other environmental concerns, specifically in nature and biodiversity-related impacts, such as the introduction of the TNFD. But these efforts still lag far behind climate-related initiatives. While stakeholders are now seeking additional disclosures around social and governance issues relating to gender diversity, equity and inclusion, labor practices, human rights, and others, these issues are difficult to capture concretely through science-based metrics, making international convergence of standards difficult. And so, to conclude, our report outlines the need for convergence on international sustainable finance standards. To achieve this, there are some necessary steps that need to be taken. First, developing a common language and common criteria of sustainable activities, ideally in the form of an interoperable global baseline framework, will be a crucial first step. Additionally, a globally utilized disclosure and reporting framework, which is mandatory, will drive more data and ESG-related risk information. This will enable forward-looking projections and actionable targets to be set. The ISSB is a promising effort to enable convergence of various reporting standards and regulatory frameworks globally and has been received positively. The board must set clear goals and move quickly to establish trust in an internationally recognized standard. The SEC has been involved in the technical working group, a positive step in driving regulation in the US and ensuring global convergence of disclosure and reporting standards. It is essential for the US to be involved in the development of and integration of standards if convergence and interoperability in ESG regulation is to be achieved globally. Key challenges remain, however. More guidance and capacity building are needed for non-financial corporations' disclosure and reporting. Policymakers and regulators must work to align disclosure expectations of the real economy and financial sector. They must act to support ESG integration through developing the tools and frameworks to build and assess risk mitigation efforts in the financial sector. To this end, regulators and policymakers must work together to set a common language of green products, investment, and expectations of disclosure and reporting to avoid market fragmentation. It is essential the market works with and responds to consultations from regulators establishing ESG-related regulation to ensure that these frameworks are a success. Finally, jurisdictions opting to pursue market-led versus state-led approaches will lead to further divergence and could contribute to fragmentation, once again emphasizing the urgent imperative of ensuring closer cooperation at the international level to facilitate convergence in international standards in sustainable finance. This concludes our key findings, so thank you very much, and back to you, Emma.
Great, thanks Taylor, who is an economist here at ONFIF, and also thanks to Mausi Oluwabani, who is policy analyst, who was another co-author for the report as well. And also thank you to our respondents for sharing their insight and their expertise as we conducted the research to put this report together. So please do download the report after the event and get in touch if you do have any questions. I'd like to now move on to our panel, where we'll be diving into the developments in reporting standards, the implications of climate risk, and how the financial sector and real economy should integrate risk into their strategies and frameworks, and how green finance is being scaled up. So I'm joined by Alexander Fiedler, who is Sustainability Reporting and Analytics and Performance Manager at BASF, Satoshi Ikeda, who is Chief Sustainable Finance Officer at the Financial Services Agency of Japan, and Sujit Kapadia, who is Head of the Market-Based Finance Division and Macroprudential Policy and Financial Stability at the European Central Bank, as well as Sonia Bullard, who is a member of the Secretariat at the Financial Stability Board. So welcome to you all, and thank you so much for joining me today. As a reminder to our audience, please do put your questions in the Q&A bot function, and I will put this to our panelists as well. So welcome all, thank you for joining me today. So I think we'll dive into my first question. There has been a huge growth in reporting and disclosure frameworks, as we've kind of noted over the last few years. And as Taylor highlighted, stakeholders are looking for a more holistic framework which is needed to prevent the financial sector from having to scramble to comply with the ever-changing regulatory environment and to ensure transparency. So how has sustainability reporting frameworks evolved so far, and what impact are they having? And Sonia, I would like to turn to you first. So thank you again for joining us. Lovely to have you here today.
Sure, thanks Emma. Thanks everyone. So I guess I'm going to address this question from the perspective of the FSB's mandate, which is to promote financial stability, and through our strategic priority, which is to address financial risk from climate change in particular. So as you know, the FSB established the TCFD in 2015 as a private sector-led initiative, bringing together both issuers and users of disclosures. And since then, the TCFD put out its recommendations. And these recommendations have achieved worldwide support. The FSB did a survey last year across its membership and found that a large majority of jurisdictions set or had plans to set requirements or guidance for both financial institutions and non-financial corporates on climate-related disclosures. And the TCFD recommendations are being widely used as the common basis for that. We also found that the TCFD recommendations were developed with a focus on climate-related disclosures, but jurisdictions are increasingly looking beyond climate to cover broader sustainability issues. And approaches vary as well in terms of the implementation and whether it's mandatory or voluntary. So that's on the evolution. I guess about driving more consistency and transparency, we published a report last July to call for an acceleration of progress in the implementation of climate-related disclosures based on TCFD recommendations. And this is key to promote a more consistent global approach to disclosures and drive convergence. We also publicly welcome the work of the IFRS Foundation and the work of the ISSB in particular. The TCFD framework has been very successful in mobilizing firms, jurisdictions, serving as a common basis. But that said, the framework alone, as an industry-led voluntary framework, has its limits as a mechanism for promoting consistency and transparency. So that's where there is a need to to take this to the next level, and that's where the ISSB comes in. So establishing a global baseline standard for sustainability reporting and starting with climate is really an important first step in promoting convergence of approaches, and it's a huge effort. And as you know, the ISSB just published a consultation on 2 draft standards, and so once the standards are issued, it will be for jurisdictions to decide whether to require the application of new standards. But the issuance of such standards and the fact that there is support by G20 leaders, by IOSCO and other international organizations like the FSB, will push progress towards incorporation of the global baseline into jurisdictional requirements. And then in the meantime, while this standard is being developed, the TCFD will produce a status report this year, and the FSB, will report on to the G20 in October on progress in achieving standardized disclosures based on TCFD recommendations, but also bringing together the work of the ISSB, the work of individual jurisdictions and individual firms. One last thing from me on this question, I guess going beyond disclosures and about promoting global consistency, I would note that the FSB developed a roadmap to addressing climate-related risks that we published last July. The FSB's role is not to substitute for sectoral standard setters, but we are there to play a role in cross-sectoral consistency, and more generally ensuring sufficient international consistency to enable global systemic risks and spillovers to be properly understood. And so the roadmap covers 4 aspects. One is firm level disclosures, which I covered, but also data is the second one, using consistent metrics and disclosures. The third one is vulnerability analysis, and the fourth one is regulatory and supervisory practices and tools. And we think that's really important to use that roadmap as a mechanism for international coordinations.
Thank you very much, Sonia. And indeed, we'll come back to the question of risk, and maybe we can dive slightly more into that roadmap when we come to that question as well, because it sounds very, very interesting. Alex, maybe we can go over to you now to kind of discuss how you've seen sustainability reporting frameworks evolve, the impact that it's having on you as a corporation, and as Sonia touched on, kind of this driving of consistency and transparency in disclosure as well.
Yeah, thanks, Emma. I can just strongly emphasize, I mean, really a kind of having an international standard would be great, because currently we are facing the situation, and we as a company based in Europe especially, and more and more standards, proposal drafts, delegated acts, stuff come up. And you as a company, you of course want to fulfill or even have to fulfill them, and you just have different standards which are partly aligned but are not fully aligned. And you really heavily try to kind of align them. I mean, you also have your own internal steering KPIs, which you also have to align. And also one important aspect, Sonia just said, you sometimes don't even have the data. So I think that's also one major challenge, that we sometimes just don't even have the data. I mean, we would also like to report on the one or the other thing, but we just simply can't. And especially with regards to the comparability, I mean, where heaps of ESG ratings, rating agencies out there providing data based on external estimates. And we see it now, for example, with the EU taxonomy. So these are very, very different from what companies report for several reasons. And I think we should really all work together on that one, and to really come also for investors, and especially for investors, to a very stringent and comparable view.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Alex. And Sujit, hi, lovely to have you here. Maybe we can turn to you again for how you've seen sustainability reporting frameworks evolve and the impact that's having on the financial sector.
No, well, firstly, thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. So I think it's very clear that it's very important to have globally coordinated efforts which aim towards convergence around common transparency and disclosure at a global level. And so the Sustainability Standards Board work linked to IFRS is obviously really crucial in that area. Now, obviously, European initiatives have also been mentioned, and there's the CSRD, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, that is also working on standards. And what I would say is that it's really important that the standards should be developed by working together to ensure alignment and compatibility. And in some respects, I think what is important is if we have like a common minimum global baseline, that should not prevent those jurisdictions, whether that's the EU, but other jurisdictions that want to be a bit more ambitious in going a little bit further if they wish in sustainability reporting standards, while obviously ensuring alignment and consistency with an international baseline. So, for example, where you may want to be more ambitious is in standards that cover all aspects of sustainability, and also sort of the issue of double materiality. So not just disclosing issues that affect enterprise value, but also information on the company's broader environmental and social impact. And to some extent, there's going to be perhaps it's like when you're trying to devise an international standard, there are always challenges in that. So I think an international framework baseline is super important, super useful, and it will really help in terms of providing the data and the information and the ability to assess transition risks, and both for companies, but for investors and the financial system more broadly. But I think the point I would make is it's if for those jurisdictions that do want to be more ambitious, I think it's important that also that flexibility to go further. So I think I would see a sort of spirit of global cooperation in this space, but around a common baseline. But I would also think it's important to strive for ambition, and if that cannot be achieved as quickly as one would like it at a global level, then there needs to be that degree of flexibility for some jurisdictions to go beyond respecting the international baseline.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And obviously, Sonia mentioned the ISSB, and this is something that we discussed a little bit in the report as well. So maybe that can be a question that we come back to, is the role that the ISSB could potentially play in this and the challenge it can face. But firstly, Satoshi, over to you. Lovely to have you here. And again, how have you kind of seen reporting standards develop? And especially as you have the kind of Asia-wider perspective, what kind of implications has this had and impact has this had on the financial sector?
Thank you for that question, Emma. Well, first of all, I'd like to echo what Sonia said in terms of the certain standardization in the area of the climate-related reporting. Certainly that the TCFD made a huge impact on many jurisdictions, including those in Asia. And well, TCFD certainly paved the way for certain convergence around climate-related reporting framework. And certainly it influenced the work of the ISSB, and also I believe the work of the US SEC on climate-related disclosures. So that has a huge implication in terms of securing a certain global baseline in climate-related disclosures. And in addition to that, I'd like to point out that the importance of the work by IOSCO, the International Organization of the Security Regulators, because it is now working on the endorsement work of the ISSB standards. Endorsement means that the IOSCO as a group to support the ISSB standards as a reporting standards used by certain issuance in their respective jurisdictions in the cross-border securities transactions. So while it is important to emphasize that the certain jurisdiction can go further than that global baseline set by ISSB, but it is also important that every jurisdiction respects that the global baseline and accept the certain security issuance made in line with such global baseline standards. If one jurisdiction insists that we do not accept that the disclosure not fully in compliance with the my standards, that is certainly counterproductive. So in that sense, I would like to again point out that the huge importance of the US SEC's work, because often we say that certainly at the federal level, we lack the certain efforts in standardization in the US. And that certainly could create a certain gap in the chain of collaboration and building up the certain global baseline. And in that sense, and that US SEC's move is has very huge impact. And because the Asian region is a kind of a part of APAC region as well. And so the US action is exerting certain influence over the many Asian jurisdictions. And if they come together to respect the certain content of the US SEC's proposal, which broadly aligned with TCFD and especially their inclusion of a certain requirement of scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 emission disclosure, that is very much admirable, and that will certainly create a global baseline of emission data across jurisdictions, and that certainly paved the way for a certain emission data-based climate transition finance activities. So that is huge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as we kind of have remarked, the US has perhaps lagged behind Europe in many cases, but this is an example of where it's obviously taking big steps to kind of catch up, and also demonstrates the importance of disclosure, and especially as Satoshi, as you said, in generating that data. Do any of our other panelists have thoughts on this new ruling by the US Securities and Exchange Commission and the potential impact that could have on convergence? Sonia, maybe I could go to you first.
Thanks, Emma. I think yeah, that is definitely a really helpful development, and as I said, I think that together with the work of the ISSB and the development of that global standard, that will be surely the way forward to move towards more convergence.
Sujit, Alex, do you have any perspective?
Actually, kind of nothing more to add. I mean, we also currently, as we usually do with all the new standards or drafts or consultations, we try to take part and bring in also, especially the company perspective on things what's possible or not. But we support kind of every effort really to come to that global baseline.
Great.
Yeah, no, I think I would agree that it's obviously helpful, and I just reiterate the point I made previously that TSFD was a very important starting point, helped create a lot of momentum, but it is important also to recognize that we are at a bit of a different stage. Investors need to be involved. We perhaps need a bit more ambition, and it's important to bear that in mind also when we're thinking about international standards, you know, recognizing clearly the need for a common international baseline, but it's also important to have sufficient degree of ambition in an overall sense.
And going back to the ISSB and this idea of having a common baseline, what kind of challenges? Obviously, it's only recently been established. It's quite new in its work, but what challenges do you think the ISSB will be facing as it kind of tries to integrate this common baseline for reporting frameworks? And we got a pretty positive reception to it in our research and in our data gathering, but do you have much perspective in terms of what the ISSB can do, the challenges that it will face? And Sujit, maybe I'll go to you first.
I mean, I think the key, I mean, obviously there are a range of frameworks and approaches that have been developed, and I think, you know, in terms of, I've already mentioned the European context, the EU context, where to some extent, there is a significant degree of thinking that's already gone into this, and I think this is why I made the point that the importance of the ISSB and EFRAG working closely together. And I think I wouldn't say that's necessarily a challenge, perhaps more as an opportunity, but I think that is going to be a really important dimension as the work develops.
Yeah, good. Do any of our other panelists have perspective on the ISSB as a global baseline and the challenges that they'll be facing? If not, we can go to our first question from our audience. So Lynn Johansson, who is president of E2M, has asked, greenwashing is a critical issue in finance, and trust is the foundation of the global economy. So what steps do we need to take to address this, to establish trust and to prevent greenwashing? Satoshi, would you like to take a stab at answering this?
Certainly. Well, from my perspective, that is very closely related with the challenges that the ISSB is facing. Because what is most important element in the ISSB proposal is the metrics and target part. And they propose a set of the industry agnostic, also and industry specific metrics to track the certain progress in terms of the climate actions. So while it is very much a question that each jurisdiction will adapt all that set of the monitoring targets when adapting that ISSB standards in their own jurisdictions. But I think fundamentally in preventing greenwashing, that the targets and the metrics part is critically important. And so by requiring the companies for a certain standardized set of the metrics, we can compare their efforts in a comparable basis. And that will certainly greatly inhibit the greenwashing exercise by certain evil companies in terms of climate action or other environmental or social actions.
Great. Sonia, do you have anything to add to that question?
Not much to add. I agree with Satoshi. I guess yeah, for me it highlights again the importance of having clear, consistent, and high quality disclosures that cover not only financial institutions but non-financial corporates alike.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll touch upon the role of the real economy later. Alex, what perspective do you have? I see you've unmuted yourself there.
Yeah. So if I might add, also from the company perspective, I mean, we always also have, especially from the company perspective, these issues or these topics on greenwashing and stuff like that. And I think one very important step against greenwashing is the company itself. I mean, you see it already pretty clearly which companies put sustainability at the heart of their strategy and which not. And if I flip through or if we analyze kind of our annual reports, you actually see that pretty easily. And also in the discussions you have on separate topics. So I totally agree. We also kind of need some global standards and also some legislative pressure, but the companies who already kind of put this at its heart or already kind of changing, transforming, they have this in their DNA or try to put it in. So I think also the company itself is a big factor in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. I mean, for me, I think clearly having enhanced data and information is super important. I think I agree in particular that on the forward-looking transition plans and targets, there needs to be greater consistency in terms of the types of targets, science-based and so on, that are being reflected, consistency in the timelines and all that. It's actually very hard to compare forward-looking targets and plans across companies and financials at the moment. So I think better information is going to help. I do also think there's a role complementary role for standards in some areas. So, for example, the EU is obviously proposing a green bond standard, and we think it's useful over a suitable transition period that works towards being a mandatory green bond standard. And some of the work we've looked at sort of seems to suggest that investors also reflect these concerns. So we've looked at the greenium, for example, in green bond markets, and we find that those green bonds which are associated with external review or if they're by financials by UNEP FI banks, the United Environment Programme Finance Initiative banks, or if they're in particular sectors like alternative energy, tend to be associated with stronger greenium than sort of just any old green bond where there may be a concern about greenwashing. So and we sort of think transitioning towards mandatory green bond standards, you could also think about especially at the retail end of the spectrum, so institutional investors, professional investors may have the time to review data, look in deep depth at companies, but your typical retail investor that just says, okay, I want to invest my pension money or my savings into something that helps to support the transition to a low carbon economy, not very much time to think about this. Maybe some sort of simple eco labels on retail investment products that that give clear standards and assurances that okay, this is going to be a helpful investment in terms of that transition. I think can be helpful at the moment. You've got anyone can label, not anyone, but I mean it's ESG funds can label themselves, and there's a huge heterogeneity. Firstly, there's a huge heterogeneity across things like different providers like Morningstar and Bloomberg about what is an ESG fund. There's very little correlation across even those external reviews of what is an ESG fund. Then you look at the holdings of ESG funds, there's a huge heterogeneity in the types of strategies, the types of approaches they're taking. And it may not need to be a black and white classification, because we'll come on to, I think, exclusion, divestment versus impact investing later on. And you may have different types of environmentally focused strategies, but having clearer labels and I think would help, especially I think at the retail end of the spectrum, where there's not going to be, but people just don't have the capability or time to review lots of detailed information. But the disclosure information is clearly super important when you're thinking about institutional investors, professional investors as well. Yeah, no, definitely. And kind of going into this disclosure, but also moving on slightly to the risk side of things, what information do supervisors and regulators need to collect from firms when they're supporting their monetary and like the analysis of climate-related risks? And to what extent should climate-related risk disclosure be used for regulatory and supervisory purposes? And maybe Sonia, I can go to you first with this. Oh, you're still on mute.
Sorry. So obviously the lack of sufficiently consistent, comparable, granular and reliable data on climate that's reported by financial institutions, that's a key challenge for authorities in the development of their supervisory and regulatory approaches to addressing climate risk. The FSP is doing work at the moment. We're preparing a consultative report on supervisory and regulatory approaches to addressing climate risk, and that's due for publication towards the end of this month, and that will cover this issue. And in the report, we will look at current regulatory and supervisory practices on the reporting and collection of climate data from financial institutions, as well as relevant types of data and metrics that authorities might need in the identification of exposures and understanding of the impacts from climate-related risks. So obviously consistent, comparable climate-related firm disclosures based on a global baseline climate reporting standard that provides a very good reference point, a starting point for future development of regular standardized regulatory reporting requirements. And in the absence of those standardized regulatory reporting requirements or frameworks, financial disclosures can be useful for authorities to carry out their risk assessments, for instance. But that said, it may not always be sufficient. And authorities may need more granular, specific information to support climate risk monitoring and analysis to inform also their like potential policy developments. So the FSB's work in this space aims to promote further consistency across jurisdictions, across the financial sector, in approaches to how to collect and report this data, including metrics. So I'd say at this stage, please look out for our consultative report. It will come out later this month and respond to it. We are very keen. It's quite early stage in this space, and we're very keen to work with both the public and private sector to develop our thinking further on this.
Excellent. And Satoshi, do you have any thoughts on this and the information that supervisors and regulators need?
Right. Well, certainly the disclosures made by corporates or non-financial institution or financial institutions a very important basis for our supervisory activities. But at the same time, there's a certain challenge. One is related with the forward-looking data, because the supervisor needs a forward-looking analysis of the soundness of the financial institutions. And in order to assess the overall soundness of financial institutions, of course, that the corporate data and such financial institutions portfolio is very important. But that disclosure do not necessarily provide forward-looking data, except maybe certain plans or certain commitment to climate actions. So how that can feed into our analysis of the soundness of financial institutions is a challenge. Second thing is, well, when assessing the soundness financial institution in a granular way, we need we need to make a deep dive into certain geographical information, locational information. For example, certain company has a certain factory or certain supply chain or something like that. That in that area, corporate disclosure may not provide such granular data yet. And I think even in the future, with the ISSB standards in place, I don't think that will be provided through that corporate disclosure. So how to supplement the corporate disclosure data with alternative data is a very much challenge. And I think that I think ECB is making certain efforts around this area too.
Yeah, I think we can go to Alex and Sujit on those points. Maybe we'll go to Alex first on this this point on corporate disclosure and corporate data.
Yeah, I mean, especially kind of integrating climate also into kind of risk management. I mean, it's not a completely new topic, but it's kind of really when that all where you have kind of the clashing metrics, right, of so financials and non-financials, or we rather call it sustainability matrix. And you also have up to a certain point also kind of, at least within the company, kind of work on the mindset, right? So if you have a classical guy within the controlling, now, I don't know, 20 or 40 years at BSF, right? Within his studies, where there was no sustainability at all. Also within the risk management within the past years, yes, there were the one or the other event that happened, but no kind of general discussion on climate. I mean, sometimes have one kind of discussion like, what's the worst case scenario? So 2 degrees or 4 degrees. So what is the worst case for the company? I mean, might be totally different if you look on purely on financials, right? So really to integrate that holistic steering, and I mean, there's heaps of works on the metrics to be done. I mean, we were currently always focusing on the company part, right? If we look on the impact to this impact to the society part, there's also heaps of work done, and I think we have to combine somehow both to get that really holistic perspective. And when I think we need more and more kind of company disclosures and really more kind of dedicated metrics. I mean, also within TCFD, you have a couple of metrics, so to say, you can choose. I mean, it's a framework which you will more or less apply to your company. And I think we need more consistencies on that one also to be comparable. I mean, this is what we want to do at the end, deliver reliable and comparable data.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Sujit, do you have any perspective on this? And as Satoshi says, the work that the ECB is doing in this space?
No, thanks. I mean, I'll come back on transition risk in a second, which is obviously the main focus of our discussion. But I think it's also, when we're talking about the information that regulators and supervisors need, I think it's worth also reflecting on a moment. We do need better information also on physical risks. And I know we may not be the main focus today, but I think our information on physical risks is even patchier in terms of physical risk that affects firm supply chains, the adaptation measures that they take. Also granular information on insurance coverage, which is and the insurance protection gap issues, I think, is super important in trying to gauge vulnerability to physical risks. And I think, you know, the ECB stress test, climate stress test, top-down stress test from last year, it was published last year, aimed to cover both transition and physical risk. And I think some of the big data gaps and informational gaps were actually on the physical risk side of things. Now, that said, I know that the panel here is more, the focus is primarily more on the transition risk dimensions. And really, I would agree with Satoshi that, you know, for me, the key thing is forward-looking transition plans with clear, detailed content and milestones. Now, that's true for the corporate sector, but I think that's also crucial for financial institutions and for banks in particular, which is, you know, some of the key focus that the SSM has been majoring on. So banks' disclosures so far are probably relatively poor in this space. I think, you know, only a handful of them in our latest assessment mentioned they are actively planning to steer their portfolios on a Paris-compatible trajectory. You know, more of them had been saying how they're integrating, you know, C&E, climate environmental risks into their governance in terms of responsibilities, and some have started it in their lending policies and in credit risk management, but very few in terms of the forward-looking plans. And I think this is really crucial because for several reasons. It helps to improve disclosure, but it also helps to connect the dots. It allows banks to monitor the risk of misalignment of their portfolios with transition pathways. So, you know, that's important from a prudential perspective, because if you have a misalignment with a transition pathway, that's going to be a key driver of strategic risk for the firm, also for credit risk, reputational risk. And so that helps to provide banks and therefore supervisors with a clear picture of what banks' risk exposure is, especially over those longer term time horizons. But then I also mentioned the point about clear milestones along the way. And I think that's super important in terms of the intermediate milestones, because it gives a visual of how banks plan to handle transition risks over time, and so allows, you know, well, the bank management, also supervisors, to step in. But importantly, I think the focus on intermediate targets, it brings the horizon of this into the sort of normal horizon that a CRO of a bank would think about. The bank's typical planning horizon is not out to 2050. So having the milestones on the way is super important in terms of making it tangible and concrete for today's management. And having that sort of plan allows banks to connect sort of short, medium, and long-term strategies into like an overall strategic organizing tool, which can be integrated with risk management, strategy planning, governance practices, and allows a clear framework for, you know, for supervisors, regulators to then assess banks against those plans. So I think, you know, if you were to pick one thing that I think is super important in the financial sector banking space, it will be these forward-looking plans, but with clear detail and clear milestones along the way. So, you know, the European Commission's Sustainable Finance Strategy goes in that direction, but I think it's really important these plans are implemented in it with clear milestones along the way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things we touched upon in the report is with the TCFD is obviously there is now this expectation for bringing in that forward-looking data aspect of things, which will help with this, but I guess will also create a lot of potential issues as well. So Suji, you touched upon the ECB's report that banks are not meeting the supervisory expectations, and that 75% of the banks are still not disclosing their climate and environmental risks on their risk profile. So you touched upon this a little bit already, I think, but kind of what do banks and the wider financial sector need to do to kind of meet these expectations? If they're setting these targets and these plans, like what needs to be incorporated into them? How can they do this? And are there examples of best practices, perhaps?
Yeah, I kind of already said it. I think it's the forward-looking plans that are key. I mean, just in terms of what we found in the recent SSM assessment was that it's a mixed picture. We found that 2/3 of banks have made meaningful progress on integrating climate-related risks into their credit risk management. So there is some reflection in credit risk management. It needs to go further, but on the other hand, in terms of portfolio monitoring and management and loan pricing, institutions are still at the early stages of development. Now, the reason I emphasize the forward-looking plans is once you set a forward-looking plan, I think it then translates into credit risk management, loan pricing, policies and procedures. So in some ways, I think of it as an organizing framework that then goes back into all of the areas where the SSM is assessing progress in terms of credit risk strategy, governance, etc. And I think that is kind of all to be integrated. So I mean, now that said, the SSM, I think the SSM, our approach has obviously been to really try to push the European banking sector in this direction, and therefore maybe the SSM, what we say, it looks somewhat critical. I think it's also fair to say that the European banking sector is actually quite at the forefront in leading and advancing the transformation process. Now, we would like that to go further, but we would also recognise that, and it's still far from complying with what we as the SSM would expect. But it's also important to recognise, I think, that many European banks are really at the front of the pack when it comes to the global industry, and I think it's important to recognise that it's not easy, and we do expect more, but that the European banks are to some extent at the front of the pack. I think more generally in terms of other sorts of things, I think we should look to. I think some of the work of GFANZ has been very good as well. So especially their work to try to develop portfolio alignment metrics for financial institutions. Now one can dispute those specific metrics, but I think the ambition that GFANZ has there is super useful. So those are some things that perhaps in terms of where we should be getting to. I mean, it's a difficult challenge, and I think it is fair to say that better corporate disclosure is obviously going to be very helpful to allow banks, the broader financial system, to be able to meet expectations more easily.
And Alex, I appreciate you're not a financial institution, but do you have much perspective in terms of developing transition plans and this forward-looking projection and data and the challenges that kind of you face with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite certainly a challenge, right, to talk on time horizons from 20 or even 30 years, right? It's normally kind of usually do, and when kind of also put it in the numbers. I mean, to give a concrete example, I mean, which CO2 price I would assume for in 15 or 20 or 25 years, and to make kind of reasonable kind of assumptions. So it's kind of also different kind of business thinking. So from our perspective, and also something which we at least see is something also people, I mean, it's getting more and more integrated into the kind of universities and studies, but from our perspective, really has to be a lot more. I mean, we have very motivated people, very young motivated people, willing to contribute, but we're often kind of missing the tools. So we more or less build the tools by ourselves. I mean, now we just talk on the climate data. I mean, and climate data is pretty good, right? You can from geolocations very easily grab it, but if it then goes also to other data, it gets really tricky also to get the data, and also kind of to build assumptions and build kind of real business cases, right? I mean, if we build a plant, I mean, it's not only for the next 5 years, or as we are building a new site in China, I mean, that's not intended to be for next only 10 or 20 years. And that makes it kind of really tricky also to kind of incorporate all these metrics, as also in the current metrics, what I mentioned before with the impact, right? So you have a positive impact on society, but you do not have that kind of immediately in your company income statement. It's rather the other way around, right? It's currently, as we are also belongs to a CO2 intense industry, right? Because it's lots of investing money, but we are actually doing good also in the future, and this is all not really kind of fitting together. And that's why we're also engaging as a company in our initiatives to really keep that going, because we all believe that we can still only do it together, legislators, finance, banks, investors, and also companies, to really put that together. I think especially climate is really a common effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And whilst we're on kind of the discussion of targets and transition plans, things like that, we've had a question from Patrick Flynn, who says, in terms of target or goals, is there a reason why the UN SDGs haven't been harnessed as a common language for tangible high-level targets? Who would like to try and tackle and answer that?
Okay, I try.
Yeah, well, thank you. Oh, it's actually about to pick on you, Satoshi, so there you go.
Well, I believe that there is a certain amount of efforts and using the SDG framework for harnessing the sustainability efforts by corporates, and I believe that there are certain institutional investors are using that framework, and also the certain ESG data and ratings providers are using the framework. But having said that, because SDGs are comprised of 70 goals, and so in assessing that the comprehensive way of sustainability efforts by corporates often becomes very challenging. And so, well, for example, the climate is one of the SDGs, but alongside the climate change, there are certain goals related with poverty, water supply, food security, and so on and so forth. So I believe at the end of the day, we need a certain comprehensive metrics for assessing the overall progress in terms of SDGs. But I think in getting there, we need to make sure that the individual piece of SDG assessment very in the right place. So I believe that I think the efforts are moving towards that direction, but we are not nearly there yet. So that's the situation.
Yeah. Do any of our other panelists have any thoughts on this? Otherwise, I can move on. So maybe going back to this conversation on risk, it would be interesting to know how regulators are adapting this into their supervisory tools and policies. And obviously, Sonia, you mentioned the roadmap that you created for risk. It'd be really nice to hear a little bit more about kind of how that's being adapted into your tools and policies, and what your perspective is on this.
Sure. So as I mentioned, as part of the roadmap, one block is on supervisory and regulatory tools to addressing climate-related risks. And so as part of that, so our work is to look at supervisory and regulatory approaches. As you know, the conversations we just had highlighted, climate risks have unique features. So we talked about time horizon, we talked about forward-looking nature, but also, you know, the uncertainties around the timing of the events, the magnitude and impact, and you know, features like non-linearity or second-order and spillover effects as well. And microprudential and macroprudential frameworks as currently designed address traditional risks to the financial system, such as credit, market, liquidity, insurance, operational risks, etc. And so climate risks, where they present those unique features can be integrated into existing frameworks and risk classification. And there's substantial work going on at an international level to assess how that can be integrated. On the regulatory and supervisory tools and practices, the FSB focuses on the cross-sectoral aspects, so financial system-wide aspects of the risk, if you like. So a system-wide approach would draw on elements of existing prudential frameworks, such as supervisory reviews, expectations, use of risk analytical tools as scenario analysis and stress testing, which I think you mentioned in your report, as well as macroprudential tools and policies to address systemic financial risks. And so authorities at this stage are at different places in taking steps to address the unique features of climate risk. The steps taken so far have focused on establishing supervisory expectations on financial institutions' risk management practices, as well as setting out climate disclosure requirements, and the increased use of climate scenario analysis and stress testing to inform a supervisory approach. And on that, supported by the work of the NGFS, climate scenario analysis has been a major tool used. It's a key tool to examine the economic effects on the financial system of the different future pathways for climate change, and authorities are starting to expand their approaches by looking at risks in aggregate. And factoring those system-wide aspects, such as risk transfers between financial sectors, spillovers, as well as feedback loops within the financial system and with the real economy. On macroprudential tools and policies, that's an area where the work is very nascent. However, microprudential tools alone may not be sufficient to address the cross-sectoral and global and systemic dimension of those risks. And so what we look in our work and what you'll see in our upcoming report is some early thinking on that. So again, a very early stage, and when we put out the report, there'll be a consultation period, and we'll organize an outreach event on that. So I think it would be useful to capture views from both the public and private sector.
Yeah, no, brilliant. You mentioned the NGFS, and maybe that can be where we move on to next. So obviously a part of kind of getting convergence in standardization and obviously transitioning is the scaling up of green finance. So Sujit, maybe you can give some perspective on the work that the NGFS is doing on scaling up the green finance, but also how the financial sector can kind of leverage its influence in scaling up green finance as well.
No, thanks. Maybe just one comment on the last point on policy. I think the stress tests are super important. I think it's, for me, it's also important, as was said, that we assess whether sustainability, climate, environmental risks are adequately reflected in the current prudential framework. And so, a bit of some of the research we've been doing at the ECB shows that in certain measures of credit risk, whether it's done by credit ratings or market implied distance to default, you do start to see environmental climate emissions sort of, if you've got higher emissions, it's bad for your credit risk. If you've got forward-looking plans, it's better, it helps to offset that. So that if that's reflected in credit ratings, it's going to affect the standardized approach. Is it going to be reflected in internal models? So I think there's a big set of issues there really for me about, I think it's an open question, but about the prudential framework and whether these climate environmental risks are to be reflected. But that was just an aside on the last point. On the financial sector and leveraging, scaling up green finance. I mean, the way I think about it is that the end goal we want to have as a world is net zero. if I leave aside sovereigns, which is a super difficult but important part of that picture, it requires all firms to reduce their emissions using existing technologies, but it also requires the development of new technologies where those technologies don't currently exist. So if we're going to get to net zero, we need both of those. So, if you just think about what the COP26 type agreements imply, they imply annual reductions of around 7.5% per year, which is, I think, a little bit more than we saw during the pandemic. So we would need each year by up to 2030 reductions, either to decline in economic activity, which is roughly associated with what we saw, or a bit more than what we associated in the pandemic, and or adoption or development of green technologies. Now, we probably need a little bit of both. We need to cut our emissions and we need new technologies, but the technological challenge is significant. There are some sectors on which green technologies exist. Renewable energy has obviously been mentioned, but there are some sectors like metals, cement, certain types of transportation like air transportation and container ships, which probably 20-30% of global emissions. There is a very limited technology. Agriculture as well, there's very limited technologies, and we can't just rely on the existing green technologies. Say you would need to build vast numbers of wind and solar panel farms, bigger than the biggest ones like each week to kind of meet it through that. So we do need like a big investment in new technology. To give you a sense of that, this is just a European Commission estimate for the EU. The Commission estimates the EU is going to need 480 billion euros in additional investment per year over this decade to meet the 2030 emissions reduction target, which is a significant amount. Now, you can look at things like the GFAN's announcement. There's like $130 trillion on the table. And that seems a lot, but that, to be clear, is assets under management, and it's not necessarily new money, and it might be tied up in things like bank mortgages, which can't necessarily be reallocated to finance R&D. So the key for me is about translating sustainable finance in terms of tangible green investment, and that requires venture capital, equity financing for green innovation. Some of the research that the ECB also finds that equity is more powerful in terms of helping the transition, and debt financing. Their debt financing may have an important role in terms of technology transfer, especially to SMEs, which are also part of the picture. But in terms of the innovative end of the spectrum, you're looking at venture capital and equity financing. That requires perhaps deeper green equity markets. Now we see flows into ESG funds. We see they're resilient. Particularly into equity funds, which is very helpful in that regard. But I think it's important, I think I'm talking here particularly from a European perspective, because where we perhaps lag other parts of the world in venture capital and equity financing compared to many other parts of the world, we develop deeper, more integrated, more resilient equity markets, boost venture capital, startup financing. Our president talks about a green capital markets union in that regard. I also think public-private partnerships for R&D in this space may be super important so again, there's this, just as an example, the Commission announced this breakthrough energy catalyst led by Bill Gates, which is to support investments in clean technologies for low carbon, up to $1 billion for 2020 to 2036. I think for me, a lot of the key part of the financial sector is trying to catalyze that R&D, that investment, that green finance. And then I think that I'm speaking quite a bit. I know I'm happy to get into questions about the types of strategies and investment strategies that may be relevant in terms of active ownership divestment. But I think for me, that's probably the overarching point I would start with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as you say, maybe now we can go into the strategies. And so Toshi, perhaps I'll go to you. What's your perspective in terms of how the financial sector should leverage its influence, and in particular driving the real economy to transition? So as Sujit just pointed out, looking at things like divestment versus active ownership, screening and impact investment tools as well.
Right. Well, I actually fully agree with what Sujit said right now, and I think the framing this issue as a more active ownership versus divestment or something like that is kind of misleading, because at the end of the day, what the real economy impact will be made is a fundamental question. And in that sense, in order to achieve net zero, we need a certain proliferation of the existing proven zero carbon or low carbon technologies, and also the development of new zero carbon or low carbon technologies. In that sense, I think making sure that the flow of money into the development of such a new technology or proliferation of the existing proven technologies is a fundamentally important thing. And so, whatever way that the institutional investor, the financial institution should pressure the incumbent large corporation to go for such the adoption of such technologies and or development of such technologies, and at the same time, I think, well, as Sujit said, that the venture capital investment or the startup investment is also important. But at the same time, by pressuring the incumbent large corporation to go for that new technology, that will create a certain incentive for such large corporation to buy out certain new startup technology. So that kind of certain knock-on effect on increasing that large corporations' investment in such new startup technologies is also the important element. And to assist such move, actually, the bank employees or any other employee in the financial institution need to be mesmerized with the knowledge in the zero carbon technology or low carbon technology. That is very critically important thing, and that is why actually the government of Japan has developed a certain technological roadmap for certain hard-to-abate sector companies like steel, cement, and plastic, and oil and gas, so that by understanding the required technology for achieving zero carbon, net zero, the banks and other financial institutions will certainly exercise their influential power over the lending or borrowing or investing companies in the right way, because pressuring for such companies to do impossible is not a constructive thing. But guide them towards the certain pathway towards net zero with certain backing of the technological knowledge is create a certain constructive relationship between them. So that's critically important, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm conscious of the time. Alex, again, as our corporate and real economy representative in the room, what's your perspective on this, and also the challenges that the real economy faces in this transition?
Yeah, I think we have a couple of challenges already. Such mentioned the biggest one for us, also technology, right? So we talk on technology, which is not there. We were establishing as BSF our own unit, Net Zero Accelerator, working on that stuff. And I mean, when it's also, from my perspective, really also funding money. I mean, with all the frameworks set up, right, we're all aiming to look on the green, right? But how do you really ensure that companies are able to get the money to transform really the transformation process? I think that's really kind of also crucial. A point, I mean, looking at the EU taxonomy, right? So you are not green, do you then get the money? This is also kind of to be discussed, because private investors or also big investors want to invest in companies which are, so to say, not green. And for me, also the third one, and the one of the major ones, is the time pressure. I mean, we will not have 15 or 20 years to kind of develop, be it metrics or be it technologies and stuff. So this has to go a lot faster, and with it coming also kind of uncertainty. So when we talk on 20 or 30 years, kind of climate scenarios or business strategies, right? I mean, this one also somehow has to fit together, and as a company, I mean, you still have to deliver your profits.
Yeah.
So there's no way out of that.
Absolutely. Any final remarks?
Final remarks from my perspective. Yeah, so as I said, I think now a couple of times, I think this is a big task for all of us, and we should really work together and always point a finger on the other one. I think we can all benefit from the different perspectives, and if we all put it together, I think we are definitely on the right path.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sujit, final remarks from you.
No, I mean, thanks. I mean, just two things. One is on the discussion we're just having. I think I really agree with what Satoshi was saying. It's a bit of a false dichotomy. I've pushed this sort of need for active ownership, impact investment to help steer the transition, the funding, the R&D, the green capex, proxy voting being very important, and all that sort of stuff. But in sectors which can't be made green, where alternatives exist, take something like coal, for example, or if it's clear that you can have a firm hasn't set a forward-looking plan or a strategy, then I think there is also a case for tilting away or investments, greening, divestment, and so on. So I think you kind of, as Satoshi said, I think you need a bit of both, and I think that pressure. And as you see it in credit risk, you see it in equity markets, does exert pressure. I think it's important that the technologies that are there do get adopted. I just think it's sometimes very easy to say as an investor, as an ESG investor, you see ESG portfolios constructed this way, we'll just tilt to the low carbon. But that I think does miss the point that there is high carbon sectors out there which are going to aviation, which is people are going to fly in the future, which we need to hopefully a bit less, but we need to, when they fly, need to make it greener as well. But yeah, no, more generally, really just wanted to say thanks. I think these sorts of dialogues are super useful. I think it's it's been a really great discussion, and I think I've learned a huge amount. And I think it's great that you're bringing together different people like this in this format. So thank you very much for hosting this. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Sonia, final remarks, thoughts from you?
No, just to say, I mean, given time, also appreciate the invitation and the dialogue that we've had today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you. And Satoshi, final remarks from you?
Yeah, well, I'm glad to know that we are making a great progress together, and I believe that that is certainly that they create the groundwork for the achieving the net zero in the future. Great.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. Really appreciate it, and indeed I think it's been a very interesting discussion. And thank you to Nicholas and Luxembourg for Finance for your work with us on this report. Please do download the report and read it. There was a couple of questions from the audience which I think will be answered through reading the report, especially on the taxonomy issues as well. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. Thanks all.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.